It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce, so I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres Trailer Court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, Big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seem to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack, and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's 30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 220s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back and had just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino, but when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bed bugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench. And when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful. Work release isn't like an ordinary prison. If you're unfamiliar with how the prison hierarchy works, let me explain. You have maximum security institution, places with barbed wire on the fences and men in cages inside concrete structures, whose days are basically dictated by the guard's will. Then you have minimum security, which is mostly dorms that look like summer camp cabins, bunk beds, belongings stacked neatly in lockers, and inmates who have a schedule to go about their day as they choose, within reason. Then there's community custody, which is more like a halfway house. Inmates living in community custody have jobs outside the facility. They earn their own money, and they get to wear regular clothes most of the time. They have one foot in the real world and usually cause very little trouble. This post is deemed too dull for most officers, but after 3 years of running and gunning at Stragview, I was ready for something a little more boring. The major that runs the Midnight Ridge work camp is a friend of mine, you see. He heard I was looking for a change and decided to make me part of his team. So I put in my transfer, waited my customary 3 months for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn, and finally got my marching orders. I thought that after 3 years of hassle and bullcrap, I had finally arrived at a sort of early retirement. I had no idea. There are 3 shifts at work release. The first shift handles the morning, the busiest time of the day, and organizes the vans and the carpools that take our inmates to work. They monitor their GPS tracking and generally field phone calls and questions from the brass or family members. Second shift was responsible for the logistics of bringing everyone home, coordinating arrivals, making sure that by the time third shift arrived at 11, everyone was snug in bed and dreaming about tomorrow's workday. That's where my shift comes in. Third shift was by far the easiest of the 3 shifts. You sat behind a desk for 8 hours and watched the GPS points run for the day on a big monitor. You monitor phone records, call in counts to the control room, and try not to fall asleep. Other than that, not much happens. Third shift is also the only shift with just 1 person on it. That's because you don't have to deal with anyone until the sun rises, unless there's an emergency. I had ridden the 11 to 7 for about 3 months, and I had to say, it was the best post I'd ever had. I had to run chow at 4 a.m. and send 3 groups of loggers out at 5:30, but other than that, I rarely ever even saw an inmate unless I wanted to. That's probably how I lost my focus. I was out on a compound check when I first noticed the sound. Every night at midnight, I have to walk the compound and make sure that everything is locked up. Aside from the 2 dorms, there's a tool shop, a laundry room, a chemical shed, a motor pool, and a lawn shed where we keep the lawnmowers and weed eaters. It's also important to walk around to make sure the grounds are free of garbage and that no one's tried to drop off any care packages during the day. I've been told that sometimes people will do drug drops when all the inmates are at work. So we walk around periodically to check the drainage ditches and look for turned up turf that someone's hidden something under. So, I was walking the ground with my headphones in, listening to Spotify as I made my way around. That's when a harsh noise cut into the music. It sounded like TV static, or the high ree of power lines. I took my headphones off and cleaned the jack, thinking that that was the culprit. Once I had them off, though, I realized that they weren't the culprit. The sound was coming from the yard. Figuring that it was an extra energetic cicada, I kept making my way around as I tried to find the source. By the time I had checked the last shed, the noise had stopped. I walked back in and set about the difficult task of finding something to watch on YouTube in between my hourly rounds. An hour later, I was sitting with my feet on the desk and listening to a creepy reading when something caught my eye on the security monitors. Most of the compound is wired with cameras. You've got 1 in the control room, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in each dorm, 1 in each of the sheds, and 4 that sit in various locations around the outside. 1 of them faces the only road in, another one sits on the parking lot, and the other 2 face the rec yard and the backwoods. I looked at the cameras again, sure I had seen something blip across the back cameras, and nearly flipped out of my chair as I caught sight of something on the rec yard. Someone, I guess, would describe it better. They were standing in the rec yard, right in the middle of the basketball court, and looking at the woods. The center had once been a lumber camp, and it's pretty far back in the woods. There's only 1 access road, and I hadn't seen anyone drive up it. We don't get a lot of foot traffic out here, being about 5 miles from the nearest road, but we do get visitors from time to time. The signs on the road are usually enough to deter anyone that wants to come this far, so the idea that someone had just walked out of the woods and onto my rec yard this late at night was a little hard to believe. I unlocked the cage where we kept the shotguns and headed out nonetheless. It wasn't an inmate, they were all locked down for the night, so it had to be someone from outside the camp. I came out of a side door, barrel leading, and peeked around the edge to get an idea of what I was dealing with. They were still there, all right, staring at the woods as they stood out on the blacktop. They were tall, around 6 feet, with a hood that obscured their face. The spotlight on the court showed me jeans and sneakers, and I began to think it might be a man. As I took in his profile and sized him up, I started to hear that high-pitched buzzing noise again. It followed me as I crept closer to the tool shed, and I had to squint as it seemed to buzz against my fillings. It was worse than before, the sound sliding across my mind like an ice skate, and as I swung around to challenge the man, I could feel my left eye twitching from the noise. I leveled the barrel at him as I challenged him in my loudest voice, the words stilted as that loud "ree" raked across me. "This is state property. You are not authorized to be here. State your business before I point my shotgun at an empty basketball court." I swept the barrel around, trying to listen for footfalls or heavy breathing. The guy had been there 1 minute and been gone the next, so if he were still here, I should be able to hear him. There was nowhere he could have made it in the couple of seconds it had taken me to come around the shed, and I was certain he had to be here somewhere. I'd seen him. The camera had seen him, and as I started walking around the shed, I tried to flush him out, challenging him every few minutes as I did so. It took a minute for me to realize that I could have heard him at all, because the loud ringing had disappeared from my ears. 30 minutes later, I had to accept that he had gotten away. The cameras, though. I made my way back to the control room, opening the door with my key, and sat down in front of the camera bank. I should have called Stragview, which is only about a mile up the road, but I wanted something more concrete than my word on it. The fact that he had disappeared had shaken me, and I needed someone else to have seen him. I rolled back the footage by an hour, panning forward slowly as I checked for figures. Maybe the cameras would show me where he'd gone to. I could go back out and find him, cover him until backup got there, and have a little excitement for a change. When I got to the point where I had noticed him on the camera, though, the blacktop was empty. I kept watching, thinking maybe I'd been wrong about the time, but when I rounded the corner with my shotgun a few minutes later, I rewound and looked again. There was no one there. The court was empty, until I got there at least. But I know I'd seen someone on camera. Hell, I'd seen him there when I rounded the shed. How could he have just gone? There was no more YouTube for me that night. I bird-dogged those cameras, my eyes sliding from screen to screen, trying to catch anything that might vindicate what I'd seen earlier. I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen a person out there, but there was nothing there now. The longer I went, though, the more I second-guessed myself. Maybe it had been a shadow. Perhaps I'd been seeing things. Maybe I just wanted there to be something out there. I was looking at the yard when something blipped near the woods. I was used to seeing raccoons and possums as they went about their business. Maybe even an owl or a hawk. But whatever this was, it had been big. I panned around to the other cameras and thought I saw a similar large shape loping near the woods. It was too big to be a dog, maybe a mastiff, but I suppose it could be a large cat or something. We did get bear and cougar sightings every now and again, but this was too weird, especially on top of my prowler. When the courtesy phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The guy on the other end sounded as scared as I was. "Officer, it's Tabish in A-Dorm. We got a problem out here." The courtesy phone was how the inmates contacted me after the doors were locked. If one of them had a medical emergency or a fight broke out, that was how they got in touch with me. I had only heard it ring a few times, and mostly it was because I was late opening the doors for chow. Today, however, the guy on the other end sounded pretty scared. As scared as I felt, in fact. "What's going on?" I asked. "Well, something big ran past the window, like a cougar or something. Now there's something loud on the roof. Sounds like it's trying to get in." "The roof? What's on the roof?" "I don't know, sir. It sounds pretty big, and it's..." But suddenly there was a loud ripping sound from overhead, and I heard Tabish scream as it was overtopped by the ringing I had heard earlier. I slammed the phone into the cradle and picked up my shotgun as I turned towards the dorm. It took me 2 steps, though, for logic to rear its ugly head, and I realized that charging off without letting someone know was going to be a great way for me to end up dead. I picked up the phone again, dialing the number for the control room of Stragview, and praying that they hadn't had some kind of problem as well. Someone picked up on the second ring. "Stragview Reception Center, Control Room Officer Cleese speaking." I gave Cleese a short rundown on what was happening, and he assured me that he would send some officers out to help me. "Just don't leave the control room. Lock the doors and stay put until we get there. ETA is about 15 minutes, but it could be a half an hour. We're majorly understaffed tonight." "Do I need to call the police as well? Maybe the..." "No!" Cleese came back quickly and decisively. "We will handle this. Stay put and don't do anything stupid." Then he hung up on me, and I could swear I heard that weird static creeping in again through the line. I went around and made sure the doors were locked and tried to keep myself from moving towards the back. I was very curious about what was going on in the dorm, and I found myself walking towards the kitchens before I could think about it. I should, after all, go and make sure the kitchens were secured. It backed up onto the rec yard, and the dorms were beyond that, so if the doors weren't locked, something might get in, right? I had just slid the key into the lock that separated the offices from the kitchen when I heard the frantic pounding of fists. I threw the door open and saw a handful of scared inmates at the back door to the kitchen. They were pounding on the glass hard enough to send cracks running through it, and some of them were looking behind with terrified, jerky glances. Some of them stepped back when they saw the shotgun, but started pounding with more fervor when they saw I was the one holding it. "Please, let us in. These things out here are going to kill us." I glanced out back over the top of the drop sink and saw an abattoir spreading across the blacktop. The overhead lights near the woods and over the blacktop had burst, casting the whole space in a moonlight shadow. I could see large, loping creatures chasing scared inmates in the semi-darkness before burying them and savaging them with huge jaws. Their screams were a cacophony that I was surprised I was only now hearing, and many of them lay dead and bleeding across the blacktop. In the middle of it all stood a hooded man. He stood there amidst the chaos, taking it all in mildly from beneath his black hood. The beasts moved around him, long chitinous bodies moving gracefully, and I almost sensed his approval of it all. Had he brought them here? Were these his pets? My mind tried to make sense of it all, even as that skeletal reeing drove an ice pick into my brain. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine through the window, and I heard the screams dim a little as though someone had turned down a radio. His eyes bore into mine, and I could feel him root around in my brain like fingers over my scalp. The inmates at the door kept shrieking, but I hardly noticed when something came along and dragged them away. Many of the things seemed to be dragging my inmates towards the woods, but the man in the hood commanded my full attention. When he spoke in my head, it didn't even seem that odd. "We don't want you, watchman. Sleep and live to tell your friends what you've seen here. Oh, and be sure to give the warden a special message from me. Be sure to tell him that Reese sends his regards." Then that loud ringing reached a fever pitch, and I felt warmth trickling down the side of my head. My knees cut loose, and I split the left knee of my uniform pants as I crashed to the kitchen floor. I was suddenly assaulted by the loudest ringing I had ever heard, and it felt like a bolt of lightning was rocketing around in my skull. Fortunately, I didn't have long to suffer. I blacked out just as my hands came up to try to cover my bleeding ears. I wasn't aware of anything else until someone slapped me across the face, and I realized I was on the ground. They brought me to the prison and tossed me in a holding cell. That's where I'm awaiting the warden while he compiles the report from the work camp. From what I was told by the yard sergeant, a blunt man who came to interrogate me like a freaking inmate, all the inmates at the center are gone. I told him about the things, about the men, the bodies, and the blood out on the rec yard, but he didn't believe me. The sergeant said they hadn't found any bodies or blood there. The only person they found was me, asleep on the floor after making a disturbing call to the prison about someone attacking the work camp. The doors to the dorms were open, the locks missing, and they expect that there is now a roving band of inmates in the Stragview woods. The only person that seemed to believe me was the warden. He met me at the gate, asking me what had happened and what I had seen. I told him everything. I told him about the big creatures, like hunting cats, that had broken into the dorm, and the blip on the camera I'd seen as they moved around. I told him about the phone call from the inmate Tabish, where he had told me about the creatures that were trying to get into the dorm, and the static bursts as they made their way inside somehow. I told him about the man in the hood, even giving him the message that he had left for him. That was when the warden's carefully constructed cool had evaporated. "Hold him until I get back. I will have more questions for him." So here I sit to await my fate, thinking about the man who came to threaten the prison, and about the work release job I will likely never see again. My grandmother has been catatonic for the last 5 years. On the night that Grandpa died, her neighbors called the police to come check on her. They said she was screaming loud enough to be heard 3 houses down, and when the paramedics arrived, she had ruptured something in her throat. Grandpa was dead in the bed they shared, a heart attack, and they zipped Grandpa into that black bag that would take him to the morgue. They carried Grandma out on a stretcher, however. After that, she wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. She just laid in bed and stared at the ceiling of her room in Shady Lane Nursing Home. My grandma, always a strong lady, is fed mechanically. She wears a diaper that an orderly has to change. The physical exercise she gets comes in the form of a physical therapist moving her legs for her as she stays in bed. If she leaves the room, it's because Denise or Reggie, the only 2 orderlies that seem to give a crap about the residents, lift her into her wheelchair and take her outside, or maybe to use the resource center, which is really just a fancy word for the TV room. I begin my story in this way, so you'll know how weird today's events were. I'm a 35-year-old father of 2. I've been married since I was 27 to the love of my life. I thought that after 8 years of marriage and raising kids, nothing could get to me like it did today. I'm sitting at my computer, a bottle of scotch at my elbow, sinking into a fear of returning to my marriage bed. It all started when I went to visit my grandma today. My family has a system. My mom and dad go visit grandma on Monday. I visit on Wednesday. My little sister Lisa goes on Friday. And we all go to visit on Sunday after church. My wife doesn't go every time, but she comes with me sometimes. She's known Grandma since we were 17, and she remembers her before her current condition. She wasn't particularly close with my grandparents, but I think she likes to be there for me. My grandma and I have always been close. I love my grandma, and I don't want to waste the time I might have left with her. Whether she knows I'm there or not, it's the thought that counts, and I owe her that much. I went on my lunch break today to see her. Reggie was there when I came in. He gave me a big smile as he finished fussing with her pillows. "It always warms my heart to see you and your sister coming to visit the old girl," he said. He let me know her vitals, told me about the doctor's visit she'd had last week, and then he said he'd leave us to our visit. Just me and Grandma. I took out my lunch and made some one-sided small talk as I ate. I had read somewhere that coma patients are aware that someone is talking to them, and in some cases, it sometimes helps them come out of it. Grandma wasn't really in a coma. No one really knew what was going on with her, but I like to think that maybe one day she'd come out of it and thank me for all the lovely visits. She'd say that it was my voice that had kept her going all those years. I'm pretty sure my sister just played on her phone the whole time she was there, and I'd feel like I'd helped Grandma in some way, while she was going through some troubled times. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. I was just telling Grandma about a client I had helped at work when she suddenly inhaled sharply and exhaled in a rattling, skeletal way. I paused, my hand still holding hers as it always did, and was about to get Reggie. Suddenly, the hand tightened spasmodically, and she made another of those rattling breaths, her eyes rolling wildly. She was like a frightened horse looking for an escape, and though it was the middle of the day, I felt a cold chill run through me as she shuddered and gasped in pure terror. "His hands, the hands of the dead," she breathed out. I pushed back suddenly, letting go of her clenching hand. "Grandma, are you? Oh, listen to me. I don't have much time, Bug." She was awake. Her face was pale and thin, her hands little more than fleshy claws, but she was awake. She was looking at me in that way that people look at fire exits in infernos, and as I tried to get up, she reached out again and took my hand in her cold, damp embrace. I wanted to get Reggie. Reggie would know what to do, but the naked want on her face held me in place. I knew I wasn't going anywhere. She'd called me Bug. That had always been her nickname for me. And when she said it, I realized how much I had wanted to hear her say it again. "Please, Bug, I need to tell you what he said. You need to know." She was frantic, almost pleading, and my knees sent me down without thinking. This is what she told me. They had been in bed together when it had happened. They were both at that advanced age where laying together was just that. The two were in bed, sleeping, just being with each other, when Granddad had suddenly woken her up. His arms had been around her, her back against his front. I knew from familiarity that this was how they'd slept since they'd been married since they were 17. The position was natural as sleep itself to them. His shuddering had woken her up. His hands were grasping at me. His fingers were together like a pair of mittens, and he was opening and closing like a slow, painful machine. His mouth was against my ear, and his breath was raspy and panting. He sounded like he'd been running, and as he bucked around, I knew he was having another heart attack. Your granddad's health hadn't been good for a while, but as I tried to break free of his arms, he held me tight and leaned his mouth in close. "No, Ellie, don't go, please. I'm scared. I'm scared." He said it, and God help me, he sounded terrified. "Don't be scared, Roy," I told him. "You'll be okay. I'll call Dr. Stevens, and I can't see, Ellie." That's what he said to me. "I can't see. They say you see the light or hear a voice, but I can't see anything, Ellie. It's all just black. All just black. I can't see his face or hear his voice." He gripped me then, hard, and I felt his nails through my nightshirt as he did it. His heart attack was bad, and I was terrified that he wouldn't come through this time. I tried to break free. I tried to get loose, but his arms were so rigid that I couldn't get away. The whole time he's just panting and telling me how there's nothing there, and it's all just blackness, and he knows there's nothing there.
He kept right on repeating it, even as his voice went on and on, until finally it just went out. And then he leaned in close until his lips were right at my ear, and he breathed out one final time. That was the first time I screamed. I screamed because I was in the arms of a dead man. He was gone, Bug. He'd breathed his last, and that was that, but now I was caught in his last embrace. Her voice took on a tenuous, hysterical sound, and I remember thinking that somewhere a machine must be going off. Somewhere telemetry must be telling someone how her heart was racing along much too fast. Someone somewhere must be on their way with a crash cart or a doctor or a shot to calm her, because in this room she was close to hysterics. I wanted to get that shot. As many times as I'd prayed to God to hear her speak again, I wanted to see that man come through the door with that shot so she could slip off again. As much as I wanted her back, I knew that this was not okay. At that moment, I just wanted her catatonic again. I wanted this jittery, hysterical creature out of pain. I pulled at his hand, those long hands that would take mine sometimes, and they were hard as stone. They locked in death, and now I could not separate them. His weight was a stone around me, and I was afraid, Bug. I was afraid that I'd never get loose, that they'd find us both dead right there, him of a heart attack, and me of just plain old starvation. Her voice broke, and when she closed her hurting green eyes, I saw the tears spilling out of them. I had to break his fingers. They sounded like dry twigs when they crack in the fire, and after I'd broken 4 of them, I almost had his hands apart. That's when he came back. She whispered this as though he might hear her. Her words made my blood run cold. He'd been dead for 5 minutes, Bug. His chest was close enough that I could feel nothing beating. But all of a sudden, his arms tightened around me, and he screamed in my ear like a wolf in a trap. He pulled me hard against him. I felt my ribs trying to break, and all of a sudden, he was bucking and thrashing like the devil himself had a hold on him. It burns, Ellie, he just kept screaming and screaming into my ear. And when I finally thrust his hands apart, I rolled out of bed and got as far as I could. That's where they found me. They found me in the corner. They found me screaming. I don't know what was burning him, but I saw his last few minutes before he went out again. He writhed, he screamed, and he died in agony. What kind of place could make a man scream like that? I thought to myself, I don't ever want to go to that place. What kind of place could it be? What kind of place? What kind of place? What kind of place? She just kept right on, mumbling that phrase again and again and again, until I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and ran out as fast as I could. I never looked back. I don't know what I'll do next time I have to see her. I didn't go back to work. I called my boss and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He let me. He's a good guy. When I called Reggie later that afternoon, he told me that she was right as rain, as usual. When he'd given her her meds that afternoon, she was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling as always. He never hinted at any change in the telemetry, never said a word about abnormal vitals, just told me how much he knew it meant to her that I came to visit. Now, I'm sitting at my computer and I don't know what to do. I've been sitting here for about an hour, contemplating how I'll get on with the rest of my life, knowing my grandfather's agony and my grandmother's terror at the end of his life. I've been contemplating how I'll climb in bed with my own wife tonight, a problem that seems to be more here and now. You see, the thought of her wrapping her arms around me, placing her chest against my back, it makes me want to shudder right out of my skin. What would I do if she woke up in the throes of a heart attack? What would I do if she whispered those same hopeless words into my ear as she died? What would I do if I found myself trapped in my own dying love's last embrace?
I work in a hospital call center. It's not great work, but it pays the bills. Though you may not think it, you get a lot of calls during the 8-hour shift you work. Usually it's just people trying to find a relative who might be in there, someone trying to schedule an appointment and surgery, maybe even someone seeking medical advice. I'm apparently not qualified to do any of those things, so the job became a lot of telling people, "1 moment please while I transfer you." Then you send them off to their desired department, or not, and you get to talk to them again, except less polite this time. You get a lot of angry people too, most looking for billing, or maybe because they got charged for a hospital service they didn't receive. Those people are best sent off as quickly as possible, before they can get a good head of steam going. There are 4 to 6 of us in the department at any given time. It's mostly college kids trying to pay their bills, or older people looking for a little extra on top of their social security. All in all, I think around 10 of us work the switchboard, and you get to know your coworkers pretty well, especially when there's so few of you. We also take turns working the midnight shift, most of us working the day or the mid shift primarily, and at the end of the month, we all walk away with a nice chunk of overtime for our troubles. People being people, there's always 12 or 16 hours of overtime a month. No one minds much, the job's pretty easy, and I liked having a job where I could finish my schoolwork or play on my phone for 8 to 16 hours and still get paid. That was before the heavy breather. Not a week went by where he didn't get at least one notation in the logbook. The notations were supposed to be for strange or unusual calls. For the last few months, most of the entries have been a heavy breather. We had named the caller because their calls were all pretty much the same. You'd pick up the phone and hear the telltale heavy breathing on the other end and know what was going on. We all just figured it was some pervert, some lonely sicko trying to get his rocks off to someone on the other end. You'd hang up before he could get his satisfaction and make a note of it in the logbook. I say these things like they were regular occurrences, but in truth I had yet to get the mystery caller. Every other operator had gotten him at least twice, some of them 3 or 4 times, but I had never managed to see what all the fuss was about. I would get my wish a couple of days later, though. 3 days of midnights? My boss just shrugged at me as she sank the push pin into the bulletin board. She posted our schedules by hand every week, despite the rest of the hospital having access to an electronic payroll system which generated the schedule for them. Martha is old school, though. Probably since she's been here since they pulled her out of the foundation when they broke ground. She's one of the best bosses I've ever had, too. She doesn't like how short-handed we are any more than we do. "Sorry, kid. Roger says he's taking the weekend off to go visit his boyfriend. He's always doing this on such short notice. I swear I'd have fired him on the spot if we weren't so short-handed. Still, all 3 nights? You're the only one with an open schedule, kid. I'll give you next weekend off if you want it. Scout's honor." Martha made the promise so freely that I took her up on it in a heartbeat. A promise from Martha was worth its weight in gold. She couldn't possibly have known that this would likely be the last weekend I'd ever sit behind that desk. Friday night went pretty normally. I arrived at 11 p.m., brewed a thermos of coffee, and got to my desk around 11:15. Jordan and Aiden were there, finishing up their calls and cleaning up their stations as they waited for midnight. We chatted a little as I logged on, discussing call volume and talking about tonight's call-in schedule. Apparently, there was a team I needed to call in at 4 a.m. for a 5 a.m. case, and they added that the heavy breather had been calling a lot today. They don't say anything, they just keep calling about once an hour, like they're looking for someone. Pam swears she heard them say a name before they hung up, but Pam likes to make stuff up for attention. I got a little excited when Jordan told me that. If they were calling more often, then maybe I'd get to talk to them. I know it's weird to hope that a crazy person will call up and breathe on the phone, but I really wanted to experience it. I felt like it would make me like everyone else, and I was a little sore that I hadn't gotten him yet. I would get my wish about an hour later. It was about 12:30 when they called. I was sitting in the call center basement, sipping coffee and checking Reddit on my phone, when I heard the computer chirp and inform me that I had a call. It was from an unlisted number, not that uncommon, so I picked it up without thinking much about it. When I picked it up, it sounded like someone was sitting too close to a fan. The blowing was annoying, but I was a professional, and I tried to power through it. "Southwest Medical Center, how may I help you?" The noise on the other end sounded different slightly. I realized all at once that it was rain coming down hard on a window somewhere. Was it raining outside? It hadn't been when I came in. There hadn't been a cloud in the sky, actually. The rain covered it slightly, but as I sat in silence, I began to hear the deep breathing on the other end. There he was. There was the weird caller. "Hello, Southwest Medical, can I help you?" The breathing persisted, overtopped by the rain that hit hard on the window of wherever they were. I reached for the book to start scribbling down the usual message when I heard something over the phone. I heard a voice. "Sorry?" I asked, taken aback a little. "It's always dark here." The pen fell out of my hand. No one had ever heard this person talk. It was always just heavy breathing for a couple of minutes before they hung up. Had they been waiting for something? I wondered for a moment if they'd talked before and maybe no one had told me. Was I the first one they'd ever talked to? "It's always dark here," they repeated, and this time I stopped thinking and started listening. "Where are you?" I asked, not sure what else to say. "The rain is so loud tonight." The voice was neither male or female and sounded low and growly, like someone getting over a cold. "Look, I'm not sure who you are, but you've called a hospital. If you need some help, I'll be happy to help you, but otherwise, I need to—" "Cherish says hi," the voice whispered. That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had a sister named Cherish. She was about 12, and as far as I knew, she was asleep at my parents' house. I shook off my fear and began to become a little angry. Whoever this was, they were obviously having a laugh on my account, and it really wasn't funny. "Who is this? Roger, is this you? I swear to God, I'm going to HR if this is you. This isn't even a little bit funny. You need to stop." That's when the line went dead. I held the phone against my ear for a few more seconds before putting it in the cradle and looking around nervously. I expected Roger or maybe Jordan to pop out of the break room with their cell phone, laughing because they'd spooked me. All the company I got, though, was the sound of the air conditioner cycling overhead. I sat for a few more minutes, drumming my fingers, trying to forget the call. The more I thought about it, the weirder it got, though. My coworkers would have called back to make fun of me if this was a prank. If it wasn't them, then some stranger on the phone had called up and said my sister's name. Coincidence or not, I needed to be sure. My mom picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear Dad grumbling in the background. "Hello? Mom, hey, sorry, is Cherish okay? I know that's a weird question, but..." I could hear her sitting up in bed. "Are you okay? You sound upset. Just please, answer me, Mom. Is Cherish okay?" I don't know, hun. She's at sleepaway camp this week." My blood ran cold. "I need you to call down there and make sure she's okay." What's all this about?" she said groggily. I got a weird phone call a minute ago, and now I have to make sure she's okay." My phone rang, and I looked at the number. Unknown name, unknown number. It couldn't be them again. "Mom, I need to call you back. Just promise me that you'll call the camp and make sure she's okay." Mom said she would, and I hung up and picked up the incoming call. I was immediately bombarded by the sound of rain on glass and muffled heavy breathing. The caller's voice sounded watery, slurry, like they'd recently choked on some water. They sounded like someone with a sore throat or a bad case of pneumonia. Like a drowned person. "Hello? Hello? Who is this?" "Cherish needs your help." I gritted my teeth and tried not to scream into the phone. "Whoever this is, you need to stop. I'm not amused. You're not funny. I want you to..." "He's gone to get her. She thinks he's her friend, but he isn't. He wants to hurt her. You have to stop him." "Who's gone to get her?" "The woodsman. He's a bad man. He wants your sister." I didn't have the slightest idea who this person was talking about, but whatever their game was, I was starting to get freaked out. "Look, this isn't funny. If this is a joke or something, it's really gone to..." The line went dead then, and I was left with static. I spent the next hour in a fitful state. I didn't want to call Mom back and bother her with this, but what if whoever that was wasn't kidding around? Surely my sister wasn't stupid enough to just go off with someone into the woods, right? I didn't know, and that lack of knowledge made me nervous. I began to feel the walls of the basement closing in on me, and the claustrophobic feeling made me shake. When the phone rang again, I caught it on the first ring without even really looking. "Hello?" I could hear the quaver in my voice. The rain was softer now, but the voice was no less intrusive. "He has her!" It all but screamed at me, and I thought I could hear someone in the background crying and screaming just under that husky rasp. "He's hurting her! Please, hurry! Where are you?" I screamed at them, leaning forward as though I could fall into the computer screen. Where has he taken her? If this was a prank, I was buying it hook, line, and sinker. I could hear someone, a small girl it sounded like, screaming and crying as someone did God knew what to her. My cell phone roared to life. I looked down to see it was Mom and picked it up without thinking. Mom was hysterical on the other end. She and Dad were in the car, driving up to the camp. The counselors had gone to check on Cherish and found her bed empty. What's more, they found muddy boot tracks going into her cabin and then leaving out the other way. They can't seem to track them. The rain here, it's been torrential. The state police are bringing in the tracking dogs, and they're going to start as soon as they can. "She's in the woods, Mom. Someone has her," I sputtered out, still hearing the screams on the phone. Mom was silent for a few breaths. "How do you know that?" "I've got a caller on the phone who says she's alive, but it sounds like he's hurting her. They're in the woods, Mom. Tell them to search the woods." She hung up on me, and when I picked up the phone, it had gone dead again. I sat in the silence and felt utterly impotent. Should I leave and go help them look? My job wasn't really the thing holding me there. I was sure people would understand if I abandoned my post, but I was hoping that the mystery caller would give me more information. Every second counted now. If my information would help them find my sister a little quicker, then all the better. I muddled through a few late-night calls while I waited, and I'm sure the people on the other end could tell I was tense. After an hour, Mom called to let me know that they'd arrived at the camp. The rain had made it very difficult for the dogs to find a trail, but they'd started searching the woods anyway. The police were confident they could locate her, but Mom wasn't so sure. She sounded scared and tired and just plain defeated. When she hung up, I stared at the phone on my desk and willed the mystery caller to call again. They'd been so chatty before. Why had they gone silent now? I pulled up call logs on my computer then and started trying to find the number. No name, no number was all I ever got. I know in movies the police can easily decode these private numbers, but I work for a hospital and not even the emergency part of the hospital. My resources were limited to what I could do on my out-of-date computer. When the phone rang 20 minutes later, I looked at the number and almost knocked it off the desk in my haste. No name, no number. "Hello? Hello? Where are you? I need you to—" "He's killing her! He's trying to make it last, but he's killing her!" the voice whispered harshly. "Where are you? The police are looking for her, but I need to know where you are." The voice was silent for a moment, and I thought I'd lost them again. On the other end, I could hear whimpers, and the person making those noises sounded broken. Hot tears ran down my face as I listened to what could be my sister's final moments. I began to beg the voice to tell me where they were. I lay my hands against the desk and cried, letting the tears flow as the voice seemed to contemplate how to answer me. "When I played here, it was about a mile from the camp, over a creek, past the blackberry fields, and up a little hill. His house is at the top of that hill. I've been here for so long, though. I don't know if any of those things are still here. Please hurry. She doesn't have much longer." Then the line went dead. I called my mom and gave her the information. When she relayed it to the counselor, they knew exactly where she was talking about. The house belonged to the groundskeeper, and he had lived there for quite a long time. She said the police were on their way now to check it out, and she asked me to thank the person on the phone if they called back. I waited for an hour, another long and agonizing hour, and when my cell phone rang, the number made my skin crawl. Unknown name, unknown caller. Were they calling my cell phone this time? That seemed unlikely, and when I picked it up, I was greeted not by the raspy voice of the sick child, but by the stony voice of Officer Darraway from the state police. He told me they'd found Cherish and the groundskeeper in his cabin. "She ain't in a good way. The bastard used the time he had to do some pretty upsetting things. She's alive, and we're sending her on the next flight to the nearest hospital. That's the one you work at, I believe." I thanked him and told him to tell my parents that I'd be waiting for her when she got here. "Your mama tells me you've been in contact with another child, and they gave you directions to find your sister." "Yes, she just called me out of the blue. I don't even know how she got my number." He was silent for a moment. "You'll forgive me for saying so, but That seems highly unlikely. How do you mean? I said, startled. The groundskeeper didn't have a phone in his cabin. His cell phone was on his person when we recovered him, and there's no other child in that cabin. That's impossible. They said they'd been there for a very long time. They've been calling for weeks. Look, I appreciate you helping us find your sister, but this whole story seems very far-fetched. That being said, I don't think we'd have found your sister without your help. I want to take a statement from you when I get there, but just know we don't consider you in any way connected to this, despite the oddness of your claim. I thanked him, and he thanked me before hanging up. I was getting ready to call Marta, the 6 a.m. person, so she could come in a little early to relieve me, when a familiar caller popped up on my screen. No name, no number. I picked it up as I prepared to thank the caller for their help. I had just started thanking them when I heard the heavy breathing on the other end, and stopped. The sound was completely different. The caller had a husky tone to his breath, and you could clearly hear their breathing jagged up and down as they went about whatever they were doing. This was no child's breathing. This was an adult, and I hung up the call before I could think too much about it. I sat there in a daze as I pulled the call log towards me. I logged the heavy breather, but thought for a moment about recording the other caller too. They had saved my sister's life, whoever they had been, and I decided not to add them to the log. I called Marta and told her what had happened. She agreed to come in for me and said she'd see me soon before hanging up. I'm sitting with my sister in the ICU as I write this, but I can't help but wonder who that mysterious caller was. How did they call me? How did they know where to find me? My sister is heavily sedated right now, but I'm a little afraid of what she might tell me when she comes to. Does she know the girl who called me? Did she tell her how to contact me? I'm afraid to go back to work now. I'm afraid of who else might call me when I again man that desk. What other lost souls might be just a phone call away? I pushed the sign into the ground and looked at the kids gathering up the street with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Keep off the dirt," it read. I'd seen the way their eyes gleam when the truck came to deliver it, deciding on a preemptive strike. A tall pile of fill dirt was irresistible for small children, and I needed as much of the dirt for my project as possible. Having it scattered all over the yard would make that very difficult, and I needed to post signs before the neighborhood rowdies got any ideas. I went back inside then, not wanting to field questions about my dirt. Sitting in my easy chair, pretending to watch TV, I could see them gathering around to look at the sign. They hunkered over their handlebars and looked dubiously at the sign I had stuck in the mountain of dirt in the front yard. The sign was pretty straightforward, but I wouldn't put it past these kids to find a loophole. They knew me as the cool neighbor, the single guy who gave out full-size candy bars on Halloween and sometimes played baseball in the street with them. The guy who drank on his front porch and sometimes let them fish in his canal, if it was okay with their parents, that was. On some things, however, they knew that I was unbending, and it wouldn't do to argue with me. They all looked up when I came out on the front porch and leaned against the rail to look at them. If you're hoping to find a play in the dirt free card somewhere on top of that pile, it ain't happening. Reggie looked up and his face was still hopeful. "Gee, Mr. McQuinty, that sure is a great looking pile of dirt you have there." I nodded, keeping my face neutral as I tried not to smile. "Sure is, and it's for filling in gopher holes, so I'll likely need all of it. If there's any left, though, I'll be sure to let you kids know so you can trample it flat for me." They rode off down the road, sitting a little higher on their bikes as they realized they might still get to play in it. I shook my head as I watched them leave. I'd never known anyone to get so excited about a pile of dirt, except maybe for a bunch of kids. Something about all that fresh, powdery dirt just made them go a little bit crazy. As I looked at the 6-foot mound of fine white dirt, I almost felt like jumping on it myself. I went inside to finish my preparations, getting my work clothes on and finding my gloves. I sat in the living room pulling my boots on when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up, the afternoon shadows just starting to lengthen, and saw a pair of small figures standing beside the road. I paused in mid-tie, looking up to see two small forms looking at the pile of dirt. It looked to be a couple of neighborhood kids, maybe having one last look before getting back to their game. I shook my head. Kids were so predictable. I finished tying my boots and stepped out onto the front porch. Hey, looking's fine, but I don't want to see anyone in my... The road was empty. I looked up and down the road. The kids were already playing a game of touch football further down the cul-de-sac. And I picked up my shovel as I thought about how strange that had been. Those two must have really been booking it to make it back to their playmates so quickly. As I started scooping dirt, I thought longingly about having that kind of energy. It would certainly make this job a lot easier. I spent the rest of the afternoon filling in gopher holes. It had been a particularly bad season for them, and the dirt was a band-aid solution at best. The gophers would continue to dig up my yard until I invested in a dog or something. I kept slinging dirt until the sun grew low in the sky, one angry chuck actually coming up to growl at me before I threw a shovelful of dirt in his face. When it became too dark to see, I thrust my shovel into the pile of dirt and shook the remaining dirt off myself. The kids were finishing up their football game, heading home as the streetlights came on. They all looked longingly at the pile of dirt, but they knew better than to make a play for it while I was standing on the front porch. My cigarette winked on and off as I stood watching the sun go down, and I pitched the end into the dirt as I went inside. I was frying up some hamburgers when I heard the first tremors of laughter from my front yard. Over the sound of popping grease, I could hear the scuttling laughter of children as they played out front. I walked over to the living room window and looked out into the front yard. By the streetlight's ghostly light, I could see them playing on the mound of dirt I had out front. There were two of them, both dressed in dirty jeans and colorful shirts, both having a ball as they capered on my pile of dirt. I was out the door in a matter of seconds, yelling before the door had fully opened. "Hey, just what the hell do you think you're doing? Can't you read? Stay off the..." The streetlights were dim, but even I could see the absence of anybody in my yard. I walked over to the pile, looking around to see if someone was hiding behind it. I saw pretty quickly that wasn't going to be the case. The pile of dirt was hardly 3 feet tall, and a kid would have to get pretty low to hide behind it. I glanced up and down the street, but the only thing moving on the road was an old chip bag pushed by the wind. I looked back at the pile and was shocked to find that I didn't even see any footprints. The wide, low dirt pile still looked fairly pristine, other than my shovel marks, of course. I scratched my head and went back inside. Maybe I'd just been working too hard today. I pulled my fries out of the oven just as they started to burn. I made 2 hamburgers and added them to the pile of french fries. I tipped a beer into a chilled glass and brought both to the table. After shoveling dirt all afternoon, I was tired and ready for a bite. As I lifted the first one from the plate, I heard my stomach grumble as the grease oozed off the meat. I had just taken the first bite when I heard the metal clang of my shovel falling over. I looked up to find those kids playing on my dirt again. I came barreling out the door, my dinner cooling on my plate, as I stormed out to send these kids off. I was becoming frustrated. I'd made it pretty clear that I didn't want people on my pile of dirt. I had been pretty nice about it, posting signs and asking the kids not to mess with it, but it appeared that some of these kids weren't getting it. If I needed to be a bastard to keep these kids off my dirt, I suppose I'd have to be a bastard. I'd barely gotten 2 words out of my mouth, though, before I once again noticed the yard was empty. I was really getting tired of this. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a pair of filthy kids on my pile of dirt. No matter how many times I checked the yard, though, there was never any sign of a trespasser. The strangest part was a distinct lack of footprints, though. The sand was fresh, maybe even a little damp when you got past the top layer. The kids had been jumping on the sand like a trampoline. There should have been footprints, handprints, something. They came back 3 more times that night, but the last is the only one that really stands out. That was the worst of their appearances. They appeared again as I was finishing my dishes, and again as I sat watching TV. I came striding out to holler at them both times, but all I found was an empty yard. This was ridiculous. What the hell was going on here? I know what I saw, but they were always gone the instant I came outside. Nobody could move that fast, especially not a couple of dirty little kids. And what the hell were they doing out after dark? Most of the parents on this block didn't let their kids out after the streetlights came on. Something funny was going on here. The last time I saw them, that night at least, was just before bedtime. I'd thought the pranks were over as time slipped on. It was 11 o'clock, and I was walking through the living room to get something to help me sleep. I was still a little on edge, and I thought that a nightcap might help me calm down a bit. I was coming out of the kitchen with a tumbler of whiskey, the curtains still open on the front yard, when I saw them there. My glass slipped out of my hand as the two kids stood crouching on top of my dirt pile. I was speechless for a moment as the angry fire built inside me. I was furious. Who the hell did these kids think they were? They were coming up in the middle of the night trying to mess with me. But why? I'd made a very simple request. Why were these kids tormenting me? Because I wouldn't let them play on my damn dirt pile? If I had stopped to quell my anger, I might have noticed that something wasn't right with these two. The night air was cool on my bare chest as I came shambling out of my house like an angry bull. Who the hell do you think you are? It's almost midnight. Get your asses over here right now. I'm gonna call your parents and let them know what you've been up to. I got a good mind to... They hadn't moved this time, though. They just stood on that mound of dirt like two scrawny scarecrows, glowering at me through the dirt caked over their face. My God, had they been eating the dirt or something? I had thought them filthy, but these kids were downright grimy. They didn't seem at all concerned with me, but I definitely had their full attention. I had come half into the yard when I saw their eyes. They both seemed to have a nasty case of red eye. They stared at me, their eyes seeming to glow somehow, and I suddenly noticed that they cast no shadow in the dim streetlight. They should have. The dirt pile and my shovel cast a long gantry into the falling streetlight, but these two had nothing. I had stopped barely 20 feet from the pair when the larger of the two took a step towards me. When his dirty sneakers gritted against the loose earth, the red piping looked faded beneath all that mud, and I saw the earth drop over it like a hand. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but all that came out was wet soil. Sand and mud bubbled out from over his lips, and the dirt that had covered his foot had begun to slide up his leg as well. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat as he coughed up leaves and mud as well. The sand slid over his hands and up his arms. Even as the dirt bound the first boy to the pile by his knees, they both struggled, trying to free themselves from the prison of sand, but their efforts were ultimately in vain. The sand reclaimed them both in a sudden whoosh. In a blink, they were both gone again. I walked backwards, never taking my eyes off that pile, until the door was closed between us. The next day, I set to work early. I wanted that pile of dirt out of my yard before nightfall. I worked diligently, filling in holes and putting dirt to good use. I used it to fill in a few of the potholes in front of my house even. I just wanted as much of it gone as I could manage. I no longer cared how it happened. When the kids came by on their bikes, I told them to leave. They seemed disappointed, but I didn't want them anywhere near that dirt pile. I was filling in an exceptionally large gopher hole when something caught my eye. I had nearly turned back to the pile when something pale and long made me take a second look. At first I thought it was a worm, but the more I looked, the more I thought I knew what it was. I bent down, the shovel hitting the ground woodenly, as I reached down to pick up what I hoped was a bleached piece of wood. It wasn't, though. It was cold, malleable if not unmovable, and crooked like a sea of pale, purpling flesh. The perfectly filthy nail was hardly visible at the tip of the small finger. I went back to the pile and saw the rest of the hand poking out from the bottom, minus the finger I had accidentally amputated. The cops came when I called, and they brought dogs with them as well as the big white forensics van. They excavated the bodies of a 10-year-old boy from the bottom of the dirt pile, his face frozen in a look of terrified disbelief. He was dressed in very dirty, if not very familiar clothes, and his sneakers had that same filthy red piping that I'd seen the night before. When they lifted him free, they found that his hand was intertwined with something else that also came loose. The other boy had been about 8, and the two had died hand in hand, it seemed. The police had wanted to arrest me, or at least bring me in for questioning, but the forensics guys had figured out pretty quick that these kids had been dead for the last month. A quick search determined that they had been on the missing persons roster for about 3 weeks, and their parents had feared they'd been abducted by some pervert. They'd been playing near the sand pits before they'd gone missing, and the coroner would later find dirt and mud in their lungs and mouth. He figured they had been climbing the big sand piles out there, piles just waiting to be scooped into a truck and sold as fill dirt, when one of them had been sucked down by a pocket of air or an empty spot in the pile. His brother had tried to help him and ended up getting pulled down as well. The two had suffocated as they tried to get out and been picked up by the fill dirt, as they trucked it to the company I had bought it from. It happens sometimes, the coroner had told me when I'd asked about it a few weeks later. Kids never think about that kind of thing. They just see a big pile of dirt and start climbing. I haven't seen the two since they took the bodies away, and the company I bought it from came and got the rest of it before they gave me a full refund. I hope they find peace wherever they are now. I think, from now on, I'll just hire someone to fill the holes in my yard. I don't ever want to see another pile of dirt for as long as I live.